We're continuing our study of the Seminar of Jacques Lacan, Book 1, Freud's Papers on Technique, 1953 to 1954. And this is Chapter 19, titled The Creative Function of Speech. It's another of Lacan's riff sessions, but there is fruit at the bottom. In this chapter, he touches on one topic he'll address in future seminars more clearly, and that's the function of metaphor. Roughly, Lacan says the function of metaphor is to make meaningful elements of the symbolic world. A racing heart, for instance, gives meaning to all the symbolic relations of romance and the turmoil that comes with it. But then Lacan moves on. At one point, Lacan says, and this is on page 240, quote, "Speech is essentially the means of gaining recognition," end quote. In therapy, part of the goal is to do one's best to render one's unconscious wants and desires into full speech, and by doing so, the patient recognizes his or her own desires and has them recognized before the analyst. The attempt to render the unconscious into words reveals the temporal nature of concepts. Lacan, following the philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, says on page 242, quote, "The concept is the time of the thing," end quote. He says this in italics. A concept is just some object represented under some temporal aspect and never a substitute for the thing itself, since, Lacan says, quote, "The concept is always where the thing isn't," end quote. Though not a substitute for the thing itself, the concept is the next best thing that speech can do to try to render what is real into what is symbolic. Following this train of thought, Lacan clarifies Freud's own conception of the unconscious. Lacan says that when Freud says, quote, "The unconscious is located outside time," it is true and it isn't. It is located outside time exactly like the concept, because it is in itself time, the pure time of the thing, and as such it can reproduce the thing within a certain modulation whose material support can be anything, end quote. And that quote is on page 243. All of this admittedly seems obscure so far, so let's give these ideas some legs. We'll illustrate Lacan's point with the following example. Okay, a common case. A patient finds himself being interrupted by the analyst to ask a question for clarification, and this awakens in the patient past traumas, say, for example, related to his own father, in moments when the patient was interrupted by his father and asked to give account of himself. Well, according to Freud and Lacan, the reason this trauma can be awakened is because the same sorts of concepts that were involved with the original trauma have been hit upon at this point in the therapy session and punctuate what is for the patient an underlying problem, say a problem that the patient might have with authority figures in light of his past experience with his father. Lacan uses a similar example on page 243 when he asks, quote, "Why does the analysis become transformed the moment the transferential situation is analyzed through evoking the old situation, when the subject found himself with an entirely different object, one that cannot be assimilated to the present object? Because present speech, like the old speech, is placed within a parenthesis of time, within a form of time, if I can put it that way, the modulation of time being identical, the speech of the analyst happens to have the same value as the old speech," end quote. That's the key. The analyst's speech has the same value as the old speech. The analyst's speech and his use of concepts has unlocked something in the unconscious of the patient that makes the patient's ego flare up and resist the treatment in that very moment. Lacan says, quote, "The time element is a dimension constitutive of the order of speech, and if in actual fact the concept is time, we must analyze speech in stages, to seek it in multiple meanings between the lines," end quote. And that quote is also on page 243. And he goes on to say on page 244, quote, "The final meaning of the speech of the subject before the analyst is his existential relation before the object of his desire," end quote. But it's a bit misleading when Lacan says the final meaning is having the patient represent the objects of his wants before his or her therapist. For Lacan goes on to clarify, also on page 244, quote, "On this occasion, this narcissistic mirage does not take on any particular form. It is nothing other than whatever supports the relation of man to the object of his desire, and always leaves him isolated in what we call fore-pleasure. This relation is a specular one, and here it places speech in a kind of suspension in relation to what indeed amounts to a purely imaginary situation. There is nothing present, nothing emotional, nothing real in this situation, but once it has been reached, it changes the meaning of speech, it reveals to the subject that his speech is only empty speech, and that is as such that it is lacking in any effect," end quote. But wait a second. If it's not enough for a patient to express what he or she wants, if that is only empty speech, then what is the therapeutic answer? What is the therapeutic setting and the therapeutic purpose really in this situation? Since we've already covered a lot of ground for today, let's conclude this chapter next time and try to answer this question together. So what is the therapeutic answer after again? That's the question. But we'll stop there. Thank you for listening.